Okay, I think that we should begin our seminar. It's the 11th seminar since the first one and since the beginning. And today we have as a main speaker Mikhail Fedorovich Chernysh, corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Sciences and Deputy Director of the National Sociological Center, which was set up not long ago on the basis of several sociological organizations, including from the Russian, first of all, from the Russian Academy of Sciences. And as I already announced last time, his topic is more inequalities, the long-term social consequences of the ongoing epidemic in the neoliberal environment. But before giving the floor to Mikhail, I would like to mention once more that our next seminar in a week time we'll have Tatiana Chubarova, who is with us today. We'll have her as the main speaker, and her topic will be healthcare in times of pandemic, what future? So I would like to stop the demonstration of my computer here, and now the floor is yours, Mikhail Fedorovich. Would you like to make a demonstration? So if yes, then
yes, I have some slides. If you
okay.
don't mind, I'll show some slides, and it's not so important, but maybe.
Oh, it's okay.
Now you can do it.
Thank you.
So I'm sorry once more. Let us switch off our sound right now, and then we'll switch it on when the time of discussion will come.
Well, Alexander Dmitrievich said it when I wanted to say the standard phrase, then feel free to interrupt me at any point and, ask questions or make your own comments. So this is a free discussion, as I understand. So that's why I think it's appropriate that we comment and discuss things. I think that the topic that we are discussing is quite intriguing. As deputy editor of the Mir России scientific journal, I had to decline to publish a number of articles on the consequences of the coronavirus. So we agreed in the journal that it's too early for us to evaluate what the consequences of the epidemic or the pandemic will be. So we decided just to turn them down and wait until we know more about the epidemic, we know more what the consequences of the epidemic are going to be. So but the topic of this seminar is too enticing. So I think that I have to, this was too much of a temptation. So I decided that I shall breach the rule that I have set myself, and I shall talk a little bit about the possible consequences of the epidemic, social or economic. So the question is, what will happen when the epidemic whittles down, or if it whittles down? Because I'm not so sure that it will whittle down without any possible major impact on societies, or without the next epidemic, coming in and complicating things. I believe that all of these events may yet happen, then we may witness a worsening of the situation rather than improvement of it. So that I think that's why it's probably too early for us to speak about the possible consequences. We don't yet know what's going to happen, what the future will look like. But I'd like to speculate a little bit on what we know now. As Lucretius once claimed, nothing comes out of nothing, or something always comes out of something. So if we are to speculate, we have to take into account the tendencies that have been enhanced or disrupted by the arrival of the virus. In other words, we have to explore what the situation is now. What are the long-term tendencies that are affecting modern societies, and what the impact of these tendencies might be if they are thwarted or changed by the virus. So it's fair to say that most societies, whether it's societies in Europe or the third world, had hit their own blind alleys even before the virus. The crisis began, or rather had begun before the virus. And even before the virus, they started staging experiments that might in the future help them overcome the crisis. So in other words, the crisis is not totally born out of the virus or its arrival. The crisis was already there. And the crisis was both man-made, featuring dramatic outcomes of the neoliberal policies that have been imposed on most developed and developing societies, and as well as what we might qualify as natural tendencies unfolding, such as the, if we can call it a natural tendency, the power of the new technologies, including the arrival of the artificial intelligence in the future, because now it's not making too much impact on our daily life or on the life of modern societies, but in the future, they say that it's going to be so. So what are the tendencies that we should contemplate now that may have an impact on societies in the future, that may have long-term consequences for the societies in the next decades? I believe that there is one major tendency that we should contemplate if we want to construe the state of modern societies, as well as to foresee some of the states in which it can find itself in the next decades. And this tendency is the rising inequality. The rising inequality, it's been a tendency that we've been speaking about for a long time. I think that Thomas Piketty spoke very well on the subject. So I shall not repeat what he said, but reiterate some of the conclusions of his study. He said that the world has ended a period of a widening gulf between the few rich and the multitude of the poor. The rich have invented, or at least in Russia, have invented an ideology that helps them dehumanize the poor. So in other words, he actually calls it the ideology of the Belle Epoque, when the rich thought that they were rich by their own right, and the poor were poor because they were doomed to be poor. So there is a similar ideology that's arisen in many modern societies that is concomitant with the neoliberal policy that's been pursued in these societies in the last 3 decades. Inequality born out of policy changes occurred in the late 90s and 80s and 90s, led to the rising commercialization and marketization of essential services that had been provided by the state. The reduction of state functions under the pretext of higher efficiency lessened the budgets that maintain the continuous purchase of public goods by the population. This had an impact on mass consciousness. Now, I'd like to show some of the slides that I have, and well, I hope I shall be able to do it now. So here is
Have screen share or demonstration
yeah,
ekrana there.
yeah, that's it. That's the slides. This is the study that we held in 2016, which was based on the Eric Wright methodology, in which we asked a number of questions that related to inequalities in the Russian society primarily. So can you see the slides now? I hope you do. So this is one of the slides that illustrates the perception of inequality in Russian society. And what you see here, that the most burning issue of contemporary Russian society is a breach, is a conflict between the rich and the poor. That's how the population sees it. And then the next most important conflict that is plaguing Russian society is the conflict between the oligarchs and ordinary workers. So these are two most important conflicts, and that's the way the situation is perceived by the population. That's how the population sees it, and it's a very stable attitude by the Russian population. It's very stable kind of evaluation of what the contemporary Russian society looks like. So this is the inequality that is plaguing us, that is being reflected in contemporary society, that disrupting cohesion or solidarities in modern societies, undermining the functioning institutions in modern Russian society. So I'd like to focus on one possible heavy impact of inequality in modern society, and that's its influence on the state of the healthcare services. And you know why I'm doing it. I'm doing it precisely because healthcare is now structured as a very important social problem in all society. So the Russian healthcare system had undergone dramatic reforms prior to the epidemic. The idea behind the reforms was that an all-out health system is no longer an option in modern societies, that the medical services to the population should be provided only on the basic level, and in the case of critical conditions, where a patient is no longer capable of paying his or her own way. Pharmaceutical products should be sold at market prices, thereby contributing to more research by pharmaceutical companies and better treatment of life-threatening conditions. It is obvious that in various parts of the world, the precept issued by the neoliberal gurus, by the neoliberal policymakers, was interpreted differently and possibly as a reaction to local popular reactions. In European countries, public access to healthcare declined insignificantly. In the Russian Federation, the policy was in optimization, consisting in the dramatic reduction of healthcare system, cuts in personnel and commercialization of more advanced methods of treatment. The optimization consisted in the redistribution of healthcare budget, in which which is in Russia not the largest in the world, in favor of higher technology. The policy led to the closure of clinics all over the country, closure of locally based outlets for emergency services, and concomitant increase in the number of commercially available medical services in big cities. So the policy had a major impact on the Russian healthcare system. Here are some statistics that you can see the dynamics of the Russian healthcare system in the 2 decades between the year 2000 and the year 2020. So the number of clinics and medical organizations has declined by half. and there was a dramatic decline in the number of beds. Beds for infection treatment, which were paramount in the epidemic, also declined by close to half. Skilled medical doctors. There are fewer medical doctors available, fewer specialists. And there was a particularly bad impact on the low-skilled medical personnel, which is quite important, which plays an important role in the conditions of the epidemic. So even the number of emergency ambulances declined by 1.5 in the last decade. So this is the situation with the healthcare system, and obviously that this kind of reform was quite made a great impact on the Russian society. First of all, the policy led to an increase in the death rate in most populous Russian regions. I personally explored the data and was really shocked by a sharp increase in the death rate. It's not life expectancy, it's the death rate. There are, of course, there is a difference between the two indicators. The death rate was rising, definitely rising as a result of the medical reforms in the Russian Federation. 2 years passed before President Putin acknowledged that the policy had been a failure, a total failure, and some of the vestiges of the old system should be restored. However, the main proponents of the reform are still in their places, and they are still claiming that the reforms were necessary and had brought about not only negative but positive change. The policy led to more inequality in the Russian Federation, with Muscovites and St. Petersburg residents having an obvious advantage over residents in the Russian regions. The rich enjoyed privileged access to healthcare in European capitals and the USA. The poor had to stalk doctors and wring out access to advanced medical assistance from bureaucrats who stood at the distribution helm, as always. So when the epidemic struck, it delivered a heavy blow to the already weakened system of healthcare, thereby boosting inequality even more. There is a great inequality now in the way the epidemic is handled in Moscow and St. Petersburg and the Russian regions. One of the recent scandals was that the rush by the rich to buy their own ventilation machines to the detriment of public health institutions. This was really the pinnacle of the inequality system. So what did the epidemic do? It showed an appalling level of inequality in access to healthcare in the Russian capital and the regions. It accentuated the gap in access to healthcare services between the rich and the poor. It seems that a similar effect of the pandemic let itself obvious in the United States, in Great Britain, and other countries. It seems that in all countries with devout neoliberal regimes, the coronavirus inflicted more damage, with the exception of the country that we've just spoken with, Sweden, which staged a Darwinian experiment, survival experiment that went beyond the scope of decision related to welfare effectiveness. So what is going to be the outcome of the rising tension related to healthcare regimes in the developed and less developed world? But before I go to that, I'll show some more slides. I forgot about the slides. Here is the way the Russian population estimates their access to various various healthcare services in the Russian Federation. Most Russians still get their assistance from local polyclinics. And as we know, these polyclinics have differentiated a lot. Now that we have polyclinics where they don't have any doctor specialists, and rather well-equipped polyclinics in the capital. So that's where the inequality brings the capitals and the provinces apart. We can also see that about 30% of the Russian population get their assistance from private clinics. This is commercialization of medicine, which is of course of better quality because all these centers are well equipped in comparison with what the state medicine is like. Then we can see some of the Russians are looking for for medical drugs or methods of treatment in the internet. Some still get assistance from a workplace, which is an old Soviet tradition. It's the so-called polyclinics attached to various enterprises. Then it's really difficult for those who live in the provinces to get readdress to clinics in Moscow and St. Petersburg where they provide effective treatment. We can see that only 5.3% make it through. We can also see that only less than 1% of the population have a chance to get even better treatment abroad. So this is the real inequality. So if you look at this slide, the slide divides the population into income groups, which is a rather traditional divide in accordance with the consumption life chances, we can say. On the one hand, we have a group that can hardly make ends meet, and this is a rather large group in Russian society. It's still more than 20% of the population. Then we have about 25% of those who are buying clothes is a problem. So there are quite a lot of people who are poor in the Russian society. What we see here that in these groups, the availability of medical assistance is worse than in other groups with a higher income and better life chances. So we can see that in most cases, 14.2% in the poorest group just don't get any medical assistance. 17.9% and 5.7% never get any assistance. This is the part of the population that lives in remote areas where they have totally wiped out all possibilities of getting medical assistance. So the rising inequality. So the question is, what is going to happen? Since the public debate is so structured that there is a focus of attention towards the state of the health care system now in Russia and the rest of the world, we have to accept that in the future, the epidemic will raise the demands for more equality in vital matters to a higher level. The myth that modern societies can rid themselves of the public goods, turning them into private assets and no tangible effects on the well-being of the population will be busted. There will be consistent, persistent, and loud calls for a better and more accessible healthcare systems in all parts of the world and in Russia, where the epidemic can only be tackled by the remains of the state-run system. In fact, private doctors shun the responsibility of tackling epidemic, claiming that they owe nothing to those who are sick, that their skills profile is not directed towards fighting this epidemic. So they just, skipped this task, and it's the state system that is now taking care of it. It will be much harder to push for more neoliberal reforms in healthcare now. There is every reason to believe that the coronavirus epidemic is only the beginning of the precarious age in which mass pandemics will keep pestering mankind. And the global inequality between the periphery and the center is illusory when we speak about the epidemic, which we speak about viruses. So Ulrich Beck is now fully vindicated as the growing understanding of the interconnectedness of the world in the age of global travel and global trade. So the diversity owes to mass of the population that moved while Moscow and Russian cities. The Russian medical scientists discovered that Moscow, for instance, had all strains of the coronavirus. The Chinese, the Italian, the German one, and it all owed to the global travel. The Chinese tourists and Russians going to Italy and Russians spending time in Germany. They all brought back the virus, and the virus is there. Not only one virus, but all those viruses that grew in various parts of the world. So the global order, as soon as it will be restored and free travel will probably resume, but the migrations and mobilities, if we use the Uri's description of the world, will keep very high the danger of new afflictions on the agenda of modern society. So there is absolutely no way that modern societies will avoid tackling the problem of healthcare and the state of healthcare. I believe that in Russia, there will be more attention paid to this issue. There will be more discussion of healthcare and the state it finds itself in, particularly after the epidemics, when all the details of the epidemic, when all its impacts will become obvious to the Russian population and to those beyond Russia. Public opinion is now heavily in favor of the better healthcare. The government will have to propose a new solution to the problem and a departure of the policies of optimization. I think that one of possible impacts will be that the profession of medical doctor that has lost much of its previous renomme and glamour will get back some of the respect, that doctors will get higher salaries and will ultimately come out as an enhancement of the middle class. I think that the middle class is going to grow at the expense of the medical profession, and it's going to happen in the developed countries and Russia. It's also to be expected that medical education will be improved and strengthened. Medical research will get more publicity, approval, and money from the population. So the epidemic will start a new round of discussion. And this is a speculation, of course, over the fate of the welfare state. The Russian constitution claims that the Russian state is a social state. However, in reality, it's far from being social, with many social services existing only on paper. The government takes pride in the so-called flat taxation, when the paupers and the rich pay the same income amount of 13%. The reconstruction of the welfare state or the welfare system in such countries require a new approach to taxation, public funding, and other matters in order to reduce the level of inequality. So the late John Atkinson once said that there are only two ways with which we can tackle inequality. So one way is transfer money. The transfer of money is paramount if we are to reduce inequality. It's been so all the way, and it's going to be in the future. And the next thing that can also start a reversal of the policy of more inequality is the economic growth, which is hard to achieve, particularly in Russia, given the circumstances that we find ourselves in now. The epidemic will restart the debate over the fate of the middle class, its size and functions. We know that the middle class has been losing some of its influence and is decreasing in size. So the middle class is now, I have some slides here like this. This is the middle class autonomy tendencies. It's one of the indicators for the middle class state. The middle class is characterized by more autonomy than ordinary workers, than workers on a lower level. But what we see here in Russia, it's a stable decline of autonomy of the middle class. the middle class becomes more autonomous, and it means that it has to report more frequently to the higher levels of management. It has less leeway in asserting itself and its essence as the middle class. We also can see that the middle class in Russia is declining in terms of its decision-making power. There are fewer ways in which the middle class can affect decisions now, much less so. So we can see a decline of the middle class in Russia, both in terms of quality as well as in terms of quantity, because the crisis is obviously pushing the size of the middle class down. So the middle class is still one of the possible objectives for the development of modern society. So I am now talking about the necessity to push the issue, the agenda of the middle class back into the limelight of discussion of modern societies. There is a possibility to build a true middle class society, especially in the conditions when technologies oust manual labor. But these societies can only be societies of the middle class, with the middle class forming the core of the labor market. It is the only way to bring the reduction of inequality, because the reduction of inequality in the past had been achieved by the rise of the middle class. So it's one of the issues, one of the possible predictions. I think that the fate of the middle class will be discussed, and the middle class, I hope so, will get some of its power back, and in terms of size and in terms of its quality, its influence on public politics. But there is one more group that I'd like to talk about, which is also important, and which is also to be discussed if we are to contemplate what the outcome of the epidemic might be. I'm talking now about the so-called precariat. Precariat is a concept that was mooted by Guy Standing, who claimed more intuitively than inductively that there is a new group of workers that comes into existence of late, and the so-called precariat, workers that have no stable jobs and hop from one job to another to stick to a subsistence level. However, the more we explore the problem of the precariat, the more we come to the conclusion that such group is either small or unstable to form a new class. And it's not revolutionary at all. The data show that the precariat was too split apart, too depressed to create any tangible danger to the existing order. There is every chance that as a result of the general downturn in world economy, the precariat will expand. The tendency is strengthened by the practices that became popular during the epidemic. The epidemic, in fact, boosted the precariat. And you know, and you understand what I'm talking about. The distance education, the distant working in isolation, working online, delivering food and other products to the doorsteps in times of isolation, a very temporary job. The employers, particularly small ones, found a means to reduce their spending by hiring temporary workers. So temporary is becoming a key word of the new epoch. That's how it's going to have an impact on societies, because everything will tend to become temporary. The rise of the precariat. The precariat will grow even faster than in the past. And this is one of the possible tendencies as a result of the crisis, the economic crisis, and the experience that we've accumulated in the epidemic. The danger is the precarization of jobs. It's one of the tendencies that had predated the virus. Most jobs were turned into temporary employment owing to the usage of short-term contracts. The duration of contracts will be further curtailed, and the conditions of employment will become even more restrictive in the future. It's already happening. The process is even more dangerous because it mostly affects the middle class, which constitutes the majority in most developed countries. The middle class is a very specific group that is very responsive to changes in social environment. It's more resources to politically mobilize than other groups that are more downtrodden or depressed or unable to rise. So there'll be a fight, a conflict against the precarization of societies, for more social guarantees, for better social conditions, for more stable social environments in the future. That's inevitable because this is something that's going to happen because the present situation is unbearable, and the society that is plagued by temporariness is a society which is uncomfortable to live in. So the governments will have to act, and I think that the state will have a lot of responsibility in doing something about it. And we know that the governments are already trying to do something in this direction. Even before the epidemic, some of the governments, the Finnish government, as far as I know, tried the so-called basic income strategy. I think that the Swiss government also tried to launch a policy of basic income, but the population declined to accept it in a referendum for obvious reasons. They didn't want to have more migrants in their country because the basic income is what attracts migrants more than anything else. However, it seems that this solution is not a good one because it doesn't solve two major problems of human existence. And it's here that I'm going to be more of a social psychologist than of a sociologist of social structure. It's the problem of meaning and the problem of leisure. These are two things that will have to be solved, that will have to be tackled in the future. So human beings are so socialized that they have to have meaning to their lives. Meaning is part of having a job. Having no jobs, having nothing to fill your time with is a bad condition, is something that is resisted by the majority of the population. Meaninglessness leads to profound existential crisis and results in despondency. The famous psychologist Viktor Frankl established that meaningless existence is one of the causes of suicides and physical degradation of human beings. He proposed his own therapy for the condition, which consisted in creating meanings. But you can create meanings only if the environment in which you live has such chances, provides you with chances to have meaning. The loss of jobs, falling out of a collective, feeling useless may become a reason why many individuals will take to the bottle or go on drugs. There'll be a related danger of rising crime rate and other pathological reactions to new conditions. And all of these consequences will have to be contemplated and something will have to be done about it. And I think that job creation will be a real alternative to having a society with a basic income and nothing to do. So I shall not venture into the field of politics because this is a pasture for political scientists, but it is obvious that there'll be political repercussions of all the conflicts that we have just spoken about. In the project dedicated to ethnic tension, which we implemented in 2015 to 2017, we discovered a direct causal relationship between the precarious position, unstable position, and ethnic prejudice. The rise of nationalism is inevitable in the conditions when social crises need explanations. It's quite easy to blame migrants for the disappearance of openings and vacancies on the labor market, for low wages that are paid to low qualified workers. Migrants are targeted as an additional source of crime or drug disseminations. In critical conditions, economic troubles lead to a search for scapegoats. Migrants are the most convenient of all scapegoats in the country, as well as minorities. So there's bound to be a complication arising from the condition of precariousness of which we spoke. Even in this respect, there will be changes and more social conflicts in societies. We are now seeing a backlash against new technologies, a sort of Luddite movement blaming new technologies for the virus and related troubles. In England, some individuals brought down a mobile communications pole because they feared that the pole was transmitting the virus to the masses. In Russia, there is an anti-digital movement. One of its recent outbursts came in the form of a manifesto by the famous movie director Nikita Mikhalkov, who is an Oscar-winning director. He claimed that Bill Gates was planning to use pandemic to inoculate mankind with super microchips that would enable the world elite to establish total control of the masses. Now there is another conflict. Father Sergius, a prominent cleric, barricaded himself in a monastery with Cossack guards standing in his defense. He claimed that the patriarchal call for caution during the pandemic was a ploy to close down Orthodox churches. He accused the Russian Patriarch of letting the church and its creed down. The world of magic is staging a comeback. Max Weber spoke about the demagification of society, of modern society. What we are witnessing in the wake of the crisis is the magification of the societies against the backdrop of unpredictability of the new world, its inability to provide individuals with economic and spiritual shelter. In a way, the pandemic dealt a heavy blow to institutions of modernity: free travel, freedom of identity, including gender or sexual identity, individual freedoms and liberties, individualism of the previous age, and its obvious triumphs are now to be reversed, at least partially. So far, the Russian citizens answering the question on who they can rely on in the modern world, now in the epidemic, choose one answer. The overwhelming majority says that only me, myself, I can rely on. The pandemic demonstrated that such attitudes are counterproductive and brazenly dangerous for the individual, for his or her milieu, for society as a whole. New collectivist spirit is going to replace it, but its configuration is difficult to determine. The future that we're talking about is largely undetermined, and much will depend on the length and severity of the ongoing crisis. It also depends on the ability of modern societies to preserve, as Luke Boltanski once said, claimed, the best that has so far been achieved by them: the social state, the welfare state, social services, and public goods. The speed with which the neoliberal tried to rid themselves of the welfare state and the advantages that it provided were too hasty. There should be a revision of the neoliberal policies with possible dangers and possible challenges that the brave new post-epidemic world will present us with. Well, thank you. With that, I'd like to finish my address to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mikhail. It was really great, very interesting. So now the floor is open for discussion. Who would like, dear colleagues, to ask questions or to make comments? Please either raise your hand using the possibilities of Zoom, or just express in voice your willingness to speak. Tatiana?
I would like to ask a question.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, very thought-provoking, but I would like your opinion on the following. You mentioned a lot of trends in healthcare, social life, etc., but they were already with us before pandemic. So do you want to say that these trends will be developing, intensifying, or probably there will be some new trends which we never witnessed before pandemic?
Well, as I said at the beginning, there is very little with which we can speculate about what's going to happen. Of course, there'll be changes that are quite difficult for us to predict, but I think that the best policy for us to explore the future is to see the tendencies that have already been made prominent, and to see which of them are going to be enhanced, which of them are going to be weakened, and which of them are going to be annulled. So this is the policy. And out of that, we can get a picture of possible developments and possible conflicts in the future.
Okay. So, please, colleagues, you are welcome to make.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
This is Jan.
Sure, Jan.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, thank you very much. This was extremely interesting. All kinds of material that I didn't know anything about. Could I ask you, you spoke of inequalities in the COVID situation, mainly on geographical lines, so that the major cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, were having better care than the regions, and also inequality in terms of income levels, if I can put it loosely. I was wondering whether in Russia there are inequalities also occurring on ethnic racial lines. In Sweden, we see this. In Britain, we see this. In the United States, we see this. You mentioned about migrants, which is maybe slightly related, but we have the situation in Sweden that, for example, migrants often are not speaking the Swedish language so well, so they are not receiving or at least at the beginning, they were not receiving the public information, also tending to live in larger households with more people crowded together. Anyway, there was quite an ethnic racial inequality in a number of countries. Is it happening in Russia as well? And maybe also another kind of inequality. In Sweden, there's quite a marked gender inequality in that the levels of deaths amongst men are considerably higher, quite a lot higher than amongst women. And again, there are various social reasons that are put forward for that. Is something similar seen in Russia? Is there a gender distribution, a gender inequality in the terms of who gets sick and who dies from corona? Thank you.
I think that the doctors say that men are more frequently afflicted by the virus than women. Women have a better survival rate when afflicted with the virus. Men are somehow more fragile, more in that respect. But this is biology. This has nothing to do with any social differences. You have asked a very interesting question. I think that if you regress the ethnic variable on possible outcomes, you will see that it's not significant. That economic inequalities, regional inequalities, other inequalities are more important than ethnic inequalities. The ethnic inequalities are subsumed by the regional inequalities because, of course, as you know, there are republics in the Russian Federation that have a higher level living standards, such as Tatarstan, or republics that are not so well developed, like Tuva, Tiva, and as we know, Dagestan was afflicted by the coronavirus more than any other republic. And even President Putin had to act quickly and reacting to the emergency in Dagestan because it was so badly inflicted by the virus there. But it was not an ethnic issue. It was underdevelopment, it was backwardness, it was crisis in local healthcare systems. But it's not really the ethnic issue in the Russian Federation so far.
Yes, thank you. And more questions or comments?
If I could just follow up on the gender aspect. In Sweden, it's explained that not just biology, but that higher levels of smoking, higher levels of drinking, and the like with amongst men make their older men in particular have weaker resilience when it comes to the virus. So that there's a social as well as biological aspect.
But it's not gender, it's sex differences, probably.
All the same for them.
Yeah, but there is also there was also a problem that became obvious in the epidemic, and this is that the poor, those who don't have good health care, had more chronic disease, had more afflictions of all kinds. And that made them vulnerable to the epidemic. So that's why they were more vulnerable, because they had a previous condition that weakened their health. And that was also to the detriment of what happened to them later.
Thank you.
Also had a question, if possible.
Yes, Anton, please.
You had a slide where there was a table of the percentage of people experiencing difficulties getting medical assistance.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, why do rich people have much more problems? Was there some translation issue, or did you really show that twice more rich people experience problems getting medical assistance than poor people? I think.
No, that's vice versa, because they were twice more poor people experiencing the problems than the rich people. The rich people also face problems, obvious, in the epidemic, but to a lesser degree, because they have access to better healthcare.
So it was probably the translation.
Yeah,
but
that's probably.
Never do have problems or always do have problems. Maybe that was related to never get assistance or always get assistance. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. More questions, comments? If
I was going to offer an observation, I think,
please,
on
yeah.
some of the social implications that you spoke about later in your talk, specifically about the effect of the proposals for a universal basic income and the possibility that this would lead to a kind of crisis of meaninglessness in the society. I think we have actually similar a view on this matter, and in my case, as it pertains to the United States, where this proposal is got considerable traction this past year in the presidential campaign, and even more as a result of the initial intervention following as the pandemic took hold, where we basically, the Congress flushed American households with cash very generously. I mean, in a very serious way. The unemployment benefit was raised to $2,400 a month, which enough to replace the average income. For those whose income was below average, was much better, actually earning much more from the unemployment benefit than half the workers were getting from employment before that. I don't think there was any existential crisis. Poverty rates went down. I think stress levels went way down. Other kinds of health problems went way down. The only problem, hospitals were running out of money because they didn't have patients coming in from routine accidents and stresses and heart attacks and this kind of thing. They simply, the public health actually improved. It may be contributing now to the waves of protests. We're having one of the most sustained protest movements in the United States certainly in my adult life, certainly since the Vietnam War period. And it's a very progressive movement. It has very strong public support. It's an anti-racist movement. But I wonder if the population were still as fully and stressfully employed as it was before, whether this could have been sustained. The fact is, people are in a position where they can focus on these issues and keep up the pressure in a way which they couldn't do before. There's a lot of young people too, people who might otherwise be in school or at the university, who are also driving this. So it may be that there's something which I didn't anticipate, and I've shared the view that a jobs program would be much more important than a basic income and much more likely to succeed. But it may be that there's some social energy that's being released simply by the fact that people have a kind of stress-free income that they have never previously been able to access. And it's quite remarkable that if it can bring about important social changes, maybe it's not such a bad thing.
I agree with you, but what we are seeing here is a very short-term effect, rather. This was a one-time payment, right? $3,500 or something like that, paid by the government to the population. But this was a one-time payment. I remember
in the U.S. there was a one-time payment, but in addition to that, and quite separately, there was maintenance of payroll for people who were furloughed and a unemployment benefit bonus of $600 a week. That's in addition to the stimulus payment. So all of that was, at least quite remarkable numbers, in which the savings rate in April in the United States was 33% of income. Nothing to buy. They had lots of income, and they put a lot of it away. One of the reasons, of course, the economy isn't coming back is that people don't want to go out and spend on what they did before. But it's not the lack of income. So a very interesting set of a kind of massive social experiment that's just occurred, and almost practically by accident. It was an effort by the Democrats and by the Trump administration to outbid each other in kind of a populist reaction to the crisis by putting money in. And so rather than having the Republicans who normally would oppose these things, they said, oh yeah, let's go and do it. And off they went. And there we have
I wonder, but now that you are saying it, if there is any cultural difference in the way this money works in various societies. For instance, the Finns, they actually paid the basic income, but they found that it was not such a good thing. It didn't work in Finland for some reason. So the experiment failed. And I remember that in the United States in the 60s, there was a large-scale experiment with the poor families when they paid regular money to those families. But then I believe that the US legislatures were disappointed with the outcome of that experiment because there was a growing divorce rate. Because that was really the money undermined families in the United States. In fact, there are lots of experiments like the poverty laws in Britain in the 18th century, where they also paid money, which led to the degradation of society. But I shall not discuss now.
Yeah, well, just a couple of points on that. The rising divorce rate is substantially attributable to women who wish to escape from abusive and unpleasant marriages. So it was good for them. And the other is that, of course, we have in our society, and you have developed in Russia as well, a large class of people who have a basic incomes, very substantial ones, without doing any work at all. They're called people who own corporate shares or own bonds, who have capital income. Nobody thinks that this is a great well, it does have moral consequences in that class. They're obviously depraved by comparison with the ordinary working people or hardworking academics. But they are, many people find that actually quite agreeable. So what's happened here was not an experiment that just affected the poor. I mean, it affected the large swath of the middle class. I think the difference is that their cultural difference is that it may well be that in the Russian society, there is a sense that work is the meaningful focus of existence, and people find their work meaningful. And that used to be the case in the United States, but I think to a very large extent now, people found their work particularly office work, rather meaningless. And when that being freed from it for a period of time has not been bad for them at all. So I mean, I didn't expect this, frankly. I know it's very much forcing me to reevaluate my own ideas about this matter, but that seems to be at least a reasonable interpretation of what's going on now. There hasn't been a lot of sign. I mean, the protests are a sign of political energy. They're not a sign of distress. People are certainly angry, and they're trying to move the needle socially. But the protests are orderly, they're peaceful, and they're very multiracial. So they're very strongly supported across the spectrum. It's quite interesting.
I believe that Ralph Dahrendorf, in one of his books, in which he mentioned Germany in the 60s and early 70s, I think it was Modern Social Conflict, the book was called. He speculated on the subject. He actually found that there was a rather stable group of eternal students there. Those who were rather well provided and they were traveling from one educational institutions to another, without any hope of getting a position of a professor or anything, taking courses and all that sort of thing. But out of these groups came Baader Meinhof, the terrorist group that decided to overthrow society and committed grave crimes. So he directly linked it to
some of us have managed to get paid all our lives for being essentially eternal students. I don't find that existence to be disagreeable at all. I can see from that several of my colleagues here feel the same way.
But that was his feeling. His feeling was that some part of that group turned into terrorists and actually killed quite a number of people.
Yeah, I do want to reassure the leadership of the Moscow School of Economics on looking at Sergei that he has nothing to fear from me on those on that aspect.
No.
Okay. Interesting discussion, yes.
It depends which Sergei you're talking about.
I was talking about the one I report to at the MSC.
Me,
Director Administrator Shaken.
both, to both.
Okay. I see raised hands. Anton, you have more questions or comments? No. Who else? I don't see it.
Michael Zhornov, it seems to me, he raised his hand.
Oh, sorry if I didn't see
Both,
it.
both. Mike,
Misha, would you like to say something?
yeah. Say hello from London. How is it there?
Say again?
How is it there in London? Because he's sitting in London now. Yeah.
Okay.
Misha.
Yes, please do, Misha.
He switched off his voice. Yes.
He has to turn on the mic.
Yeah. Depress the button.
Microphone, please.
Yes.
Switch on it. You don't want?
Surrendered. Surrendered.
Okay, so it was really very interesting.
Hello, hello, can you read me now?
Sorry?
Can you read me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
All right, thank you. Look, well, thanks a lot. Some kind of technological breakdown. Can't do anything about that. Well, thanks for an excellent presentation. Absolutely, it was absolutely great from my point of view, and probably one of the most exciting one in this conference so far. Right, so well, from my point of view, it's a bit ahead of time to make any conclusion of the possible consequences of this crisis. Well, when it comes to furlough's scheme, at least how it works here in London, here in the UK, well, this is what? Furlough scheme. It is supposed to offer all of those employed roughly £2,500 at least as kind of compensation for temporarily lockdown related absence. And this practice will be continued till October. Nevertheless, it is already clear now that many people are not quite sure about what they can expect afterwards, because, well, there are very strong expectations that the number of people who will lose their jobs is very, very serious. And probably the real dimensions of the social impact of this crisis we will see only probably in January next year, not now. Well, however, I got a question. Well, at the moment, there are a lot of speculations in the mass media regarding the reliability of the Russian official statistics on the death toll. So what's your opinion on that? And how realistic are those figures? How realistic is the the methods which are being used in this respect in Russia? Probably if there is some kind of a discrepancy, where we can find the reason for this discrepancy?
Well, I'm a consumer of statistics as well as we all are. So I also read critical comments on statistics, and I know that there are both statistical data and what we sociologists call qualitative observation of the situation. And they run apart. For instance, when they speak about the situation in the provinces, they say things are not very good there. Because the polyclinics or clinics are obsolete. They lack equipment. Sometimes they lack the necessary equipment for the examination of patients and all that sort of thing. But if you look at the statistics show that the number of people who are infected goes down, and that the number of deaths in Russia also goes down. What I know for certain is that there is a practice by the Russian Health Ministry of requalifying deaths. That some people die without being diagnosed with coronavirus. So they are put into a category, another category, like, dying from a heart attack or anything else. So they are somehow redistributed in favor of other causes of death category, which diminishes the number of deaths from the coronavirus. But if we add up these undetermined deaths with the number of people who died from the coronavirus, we'll see that the Russian statistics are very well similar to that of Germany. In other words, to the European patterns. They are not very different from it. So there is some manipulation with the statistics, that's obvious. And it's manipulation that is revealed on a local level. For instance, when President Putin, which decided to award doctors with higher salaries, he actually wanted to give them money for what they are doing. To support them.
200,000 rubles, isn't it?
Yeah, that was a lot of money for a doctor, particularly in the provinces.
Sure, it is. Yeah.
But all of a sudden, it turned out that locally, they were paying them on an hour basis. That's, in other words, if you spend an hour in the coronavirus zone, then you get only 1/24 of the entire sum of money that is allocated to you, not the entire sum of money. Why was this? Because the local authorities misreported the number of infections in their own country and the number of doctors that are working in these conditions. And this is what, and that's why they were afraid to reveal the real number of people infected there. And when the money was allocated in accordance with the number of people working with the virus patients in the region. So somehow the manipulation led to this conflict between the federal authorities and local authorities when Putin had to stamp his food and to say, what are you doing? You have to report you have to say the right thing, and you have to say the truth, because we are allocating money and money is not reaching the doctors. So this is the conflict between the local and the federal authorities. With local authorities, regional authorities afraid to report the true figures of contagion in their regions. So this is the conflict that also reveals that statistics are not very precise. The statistics sometimes belie the actual situation in the regions.
Well, I'm sure that that's not a problem only for the Russian statistics agency. Here we every day the numbers are being published in 3 categories. In fact, and the difference between, say, the number of people who have died because of the COVID virus and the number of the average, for the certain periods of time for the year, say, it's absolutely huge difference between these two numbers. So a lot of depends on methodology. What methodology they are using in order to assess the real impact of this epidemic. Well, just to give you the example of what I'm saying about, actually, the official number of deaths is somewhere, well, around 48,000, if my memory serves me right. While the average number of people who have died is somewhere, well, very well above 60,000. So it might give you the impression of how far apart all this assessments are, and again, it depends certainly on methodology. Well, anyway, thank you. I'm not sure that I could convey to you very clearly the real meaning of this
And you know, Mikhail, and you know, all the countries of the former Soviet bloc, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, they all demonstrate lower rates of mortality. And nobody accused them of being doing any fraud with statistics. So nobody accused them. So we also belong to the same bloc. And I think that we have quite legitimate statistics. There is a method of counting deaths by the main disease, which we use. But probably here, I would say that the role of WHO would be very helpful. So if all the countries adopt the same methodology.
Probably, I'm sure you're right, and there's no doubt that we're not.
That's why there are rumors about this anti-tuberculosis vaccination, which was very well developed in former Soviet countries. Some people allege that it might be the result of this vaccination. And the Germany, that's half East Germany as well. So East Germany have lower rates of mortality as well.
Look, just very brief remark on that.
But we'll discuss it next time.
Sure. Well, just a couple of days ago, I saw the latest report published by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, in which they are saying actually that in their countries of operations, meaning the emerging markets, Balkans, East European countries, the number of, let me say so, casualties is much lower than they have in advanced countries. So for what reasons, anybody can make guesses, but well, that's a fact of life from their point of view, and the difference is quite remarkable. So that's actually in supporting what Tatiana has just said.
So researchers will have a lot of work to do. So
absolutely. Well, thank you.
Thank you. And Tammy is holding his.
I think that Svetlana made a good point. Yes, there may be.
It's Tatiana. We shouldn't believe our eyes. This is Tatiana Chubarova. Yes.
I'm sorry.
Don't believe our eyes. This is statistics. That's the way statistics work. Don't believe. But I believe that there may be a point to that, although it's not yet been proven. Right, because we don't have any definite proof that it has had an impact. I mean, the inoculation that you have spoken about.
All the next year, probably.
Yeah, we've not yet. But there is one thing that has to be taken into account when we talk about the lower number of deaths in the Russian Federation, and this is the demographic structure of the population. We have fewer older people than, let's say, Italy or the United States. And as we know, the older people are the main victim of the coronavirus. That's where the casualties are When I read the New York Times obituaries, I see that died of coronavirus, this man and this man. They always, it looks like a real epidemic if you read the obituaries part of the New York Times. But these are old people, 85, 90, 92, 100. But in Russia, the life expectancy is much lower than in the rest of the world. And I believe that that's a different issue, but still it has an impact on the effects of the epidemic, obviously.
Jamie, you are welcome to.
A couple of things. This is all very, very, very interesting. I think you're right, first of all, that the demographic structure obviously makes a difference. I mean, the death rates in Italy were very high. There's a very population with a great deal of much older population. And the same was true in parts of the United States and certainly nursing home population and so forth. But there's something else that may be affecting the statistics here. And I mentioned it, I think, a week ago, which is there's no incentive. As much as the White House would like to have the count come down, there's no incentive on anybody to underreport. But if you're a hospital that is financially stressed and you're being reimbursed on a fee-for-service basis at a high rate for treating coronavirus patients aggressively, then it appears that there is an incentive in that situation, particularly if you're dealing with patients who are not necessarily themselves sophisticated or represented by sophisticated people, to push the count and to especially to go to more aggressive treatments, to ventilators, for which the survival rates are very low. And so you may be seeing some effect of that, particularly in places like New York. And there's simply been some actually direct testimony on this, that the way the hospitals are administered has been such as to push up, if not the case rate, possibly the case rate as well, actually both the case rate to some degree and the death rate, because of the financial structure of American medicine, which would not be true I imagine in the British case, not be true in any case where you have a sensibly run system with a single payer format and payment does not depend upon services actually provided. But American hospitals bill for specific things at specific rates. And if something has got a higher profit margin than something else, then they're going to be inclined to use it. And particularly if they are financially stressed, which some hospitals are, some aren't. But in the cases of public hospitals in New York City, hospitals are very stressed. So you can see the possibility of an economic distortion working in that direction as well. And one which would have at least a modest effect on the overall death count, and obviously very serious effect on the people affected.
Thank you for your comment. Yes, we all see that in different countries there are different incentives to somehow distort statistics. This is a really very interesting problem for me. I cannot understand what's going on in this particular field. But there is even some misunderstanding between our statistical bodies and those people who are in the staff of which coordinates all the struggle against coronavirus pandemic. And even there was a discussion some days ago about the differences in their estimates. But what I could say here, not as an expert, of course I'm not, but just as an ordinary citizen, just from my communication with other people, some separate news, and so on and so forth. I don't have really an impression that the situation is bad in this sphere in Russia. You know, what is clear, what is obvious, is that now the number is going down of those deceased, and a lot of clinics are now respecialized to their previous state. You know, last time I told you about the medical center of Moscow University, who used to work for a couple of months, who it was respecialized and working quite successfully, very successfully, I would say, in this sphere, and now it's going back to normal. And not only this medical center, but quite a lot of hospitals which have been constructed or reprofiled for the same, they also are not being used now. The problem is, to my understanding, the problem is with the way how the deaths are counted and qualified. And Mikhail Zhirnov mentioned this question. I hope that, of course, it would be, and some people make comparisons, and I think they are quite correct in their approach, comparisons of the overall mortality rate as compared to the same periods of previous years. And this could certainly help to understand what's going on. So, of course, there are some incentives, using Jamie's words, in Russia as well, to show the situation better than it is, but I wouldn't say, once more I repeat it, I wouldn't say that the distortion is significant. Yes, please, you are welcome. That was just some of my considerations, not as an expert, I repeat. I am not in this field.
I agree with you, because I think that you're right, because if there was a major breakdown, it would, of course, have been felt in society. Because, you know, this thing is very hard to hide. Like, you know, it's, there may be difference in reporting. Obviously, the difference in reporting, which owes to the administrative factor and the lack of desire of local authorities to report more coronavirus infections. Obviously, there is a possibility of that, but I agree with you that the difference is not so dramatic as to make a big difference in for society as a whole. But there is one more thing that I'd like to say to this effect. The recategorization of the disease was quite common for the Ministry of Health in the past. For instance, when President Putin said that we had too many heart conditions in Russia, the Ministry of Health immediately responded. The number of heart conditions fell dramatically, but at the same time, the category other as causes of death immediately grew up to 16% from 2 or 3% to 16%. So they simply refused to diagnose the cause of death as cardiac arrest or cardiac condition, and recategorized these casualties into other categories in response to the administrative pressure. So this is what is perhaps a possible challenge in terms of statistics. They're so responsive to administrative pressures.
Thank you. Jamie, would you like to say something more, because I see your hand raised? No?
I think that probably we should mention also the digital inequality, which become very visible during the crisis, especially, for example, in big families when all household members were in need of computer access at one time and to access job classes or whatever. So it became quite important, and you can see that there are very different. The people have very different, conditions to access digital technology, and it is one of the mainstream developments of our society and economy. So I think that it brings out a problem of what to do with this. And in this case, I like to cite one of my favorite films, A Granddaughter of President by Kiasayan. And there is a situation when a president, who is played by Oleg Tabakov, is asking an ordinary small girl about 10 years old. He tells her, look at your computer. And when she answered, I have no computer. And she is very, upset and stressed and shocked. How? You don't have a computer, it's impossible. And so I think that the crisis revealed that many people in Russia do not have access to computer technologies. And so we have to do something with this if we would like to continue with digital society, information society.
There is one more thing that has to be said about that kind of inequality. In the United States, there are now primary results of the ongoing observation, which prove that those who study with the use of computer, which have distant education, have fewer skills, are not so qualified, lose out to those who meet teachers live, to those who attend universities. And so the digital is for the poor. This is now the slogan of contemporary inequalities. The digital education is for the poor. The live education, the education at the university, is for the rich.
Okay.
I think that is changing quite rapidly at the moment. I noticed that my sister institution, the Harvard Kennedy School, is going entirely digital in the fall. So digital is now for the rich too. But in general, yes, you're right. The experience of an in-person education in a residential setting, although it's available to, 25, 30% of the population, it's definitely an upper strata existence compared to community college and compared to certainly any kind of purely online institution. So, lower cost.
Sash.
Yes, please. Sergey Rogov.
As far as digital learning is concerned, I'm personally a great fan of Zoom. I have had 4 Zoom conferences today and 1 more later. And definitely that is a great instrument for communication. But as far as education, of course, well, that creates a problem. On the other hand, digital education, in my view, is probably much cheaper than, in terms of cost, than the traditional forms of education. For instance, at Harvard or MIT, the price is really prohibitive for those who are poor. And digital education allows, well, I presume those who are not rich or well-to-do get access, maybe not to the best quality education, but to get higher education. And I wanted to ask a question, James, maybe you can help me. When I first came to the United States in early 70s, I saw anti-war demonstrations and human rights demonstrations. And I have to confess.
Perhaps we met there at the time.
Yeah, I have to confess, I was shocked when in New York on the 1st of May of 1973, I for the first time saw the gay and liberal demonstration. For me, as a good Soviet student, that was something totally new and I was unaware of. But looking at...
Sorry, what kind of demonstration?
Gay and lesbian.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I never knew it was possible. Anyway, I have a question concerning the present political crisis, and in particularly the ethnic and young people involvement in the protests against police brutality. I read that the whites make about 60% of all those who participate in demonstrations. And when I watch on TV, since unlike 1973, I cannot go to New York nowadays, I see at least as many young white faces as black faces. And my question is, of course, well, each generation in your country originally is more liberal than the previous one and more left-leaning. But it seems to me that the first generation of those who are 20 and whose first experience in socialization is very much connected to the coronavirus environment. It might be even more different from their parents' generation or for my generation of the baby boomers. What do you think about the generational and ethnic involvement in the demonstrations and the protests?
Well, we're on just about the 56th anniversary of the murder of Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney in Mississippi, 2 whites and 1 black, in the Freedom Rides. So the tradition of multiracial demonstrations for human rights in the United States goes back a very, very long way. And that was not even the beginning of it. I think that what's interesting about these demonstrations is how widespread and sustained they are, and how they are spreading out into communities which are essentially which don't have substantial minority populations, small towns in the Midwest and in the plains and in the mountain states, for example. You just see the feeling of support, because people can understand that this has been a situation in which one has a structure of policing that perpetrates racial violence, and that's been around for a very, very long time, and it's been quite deliberate. And so getting this changed, it requires, it's going to require a plethora of reforms very much at the local level. It's very hard to do. But there's, I think that's really quite interesting. I don't think it reflects a more radical population than my generation and our generation was. Our generation, I think, had first of all, we had a perception of alternatives. We had the model of Czechoslovakia in 1968 in front of us, just for example. The Soviet Union at that time was already not particularly glamorous. The previous generation, actually, you could argue that the radicals have become less radical, because in the 30s, the American most radical elements were basically admirers of the Soviet state. In the 60s, if we were admirers of anything, it was Czechoslovakia or Sweden. And now,
the French Revolution.
Say what?
French
say what?
Revolution of 68. French Revolution of the 68.
Yeah, sure. And the and the French eruption, yeah, the French eruption was the Vietnam War, of course, put a certain coloration on things as well. Now you're looking at something which is just basically internal to the United States and deep, not really challenging the structure of the system in a way. I mean, one of my frustrations with it is that it's not raising a fundamental challenge to the economic structure, simply asking for a more just and less racialized administration of the existing system. At a moment when, in my judgment, the existing system is crumbling, it cannot be sustained. And that's going to cause a lot of difficulties as people expect you can fix this problem and things might be more normal. And I think they're going to find that they're not. So we'll see how it goes going forward. On the other issue, of course, the acceptance at the time that May 1st, 1973, for me as well as for you, the assertion of the rights of gay and lesbian people was really something remarkable. And just a few days ago, we had a Supreme Court decision written by the appointee of Donald Trump, Neil Gorsuch, as co-signed by the Chief Justice appointed by George W. Bush, John Roberts, a 6-3 decision of the Supreme Court, which basically said that the rights of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer people, LGBTQ, are all covered under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, under one word that was inserted in that act as an amendment that was attempted to kill the whole act and failed to do so. The word was sex. And discrimination against sex. And Gorsuch wrote the opinion saying that it was clear that what's going on was discrimination on the basis of sex. It's not permitted under a law that was passed in 1964, and it's gone. It cannot be done anymore. So the whole community, and I'm quite close to it in certain respects, had its fundamental rights vindicated and decisively in a way that won't be challenged. Unlike, for example, the reproductive rights that were constantly under challenge, there will be no pushback on this. It's going to settle decisively by two of the most conservative justices that have ever served on the Supreme Court. So yes, the change in that respect is totally fundamental. I mean, compared to where we were when we were just, I grew up, I went to a boys' school. It was a homophobic environment. The kind of thing that we grew up with is out of the experience of my children. And I have children in their 20s. They're totally grew up in a totally different and much better world in that respect.
I have a follow-up question, very, very short one. Yeah. What about the possibility that those demonstrations and riots in particular and attacks on the monuments will produce the resurgence of the silent majority?
I think it's unlikely. The situation is really quite different from even 4 years ago, in that the person who is trying to inspire that is the president, and it doesn't appear to be working. And it just doesn't appear to. He may have lost his touch. He may never have quite had the movement that he thought he had. There is a little bit of thuggery on the part of supremacist groups, but you really don't have a sense that there is a, now let's go back to the Vietnam War period. There was in 1970, the construction workers in New York were pro-war, pro-Nixon. They were really a phalanx opposed to the anti-war movement, and they were organized and they had leadership. And now, you know, one hears about isolated groups. One hears about acts of vandalism that are done as provocations in order to get the police to justify harsher tactics and so forth. But I just get the feeling that the country has moved on, and that there's the request of the demonstrators, that their objective is considered to be reasonable by overwhelming majorities. So I could happen, and I was worried about it at first, but as this goes on, it does not appear to be happening. It's quite amazing.
James, it's Vladimir Quint. I have a question to you. What do you think about destruction of monument of George Washington?
Well, we have there were a great many monuments were put up in the Jim Crow era in the 1890s to 1920s to various figures from the Confederate States, including there was one in Washington, D.C. of a particularly nasty individual. And I know that they're all over the South. They've been coming down. At my university, we had a number of them, Jefferson Davis and Robert. Did we have Lee?
Yeah, we had Davis. The monument of George Washington. But
the monument of George Washington, I think the Washington monument is probably safe in Washington. It would be very hard to.
It was destructed on West Coast, just demolished.
There was a statue of Grant in San Francisco that was I think defaced.
That was a monument in how it's state above California, on the West Coast.
I know there was one to Grant in San Francisco. I haven't heard about an attack on Washington. Yeah, I mean, of course, symbolic pulling down of statues is a well-established thing in major political movements. I'm sure it's never happened in Russia. Right? But of course, as someone pointed out, the Confederate statues are not public art. They are monuments that were put up to glorify figures who were.
No, it was a couple of days ago destroyed in Oregon. In Oregon.
Oh, I'll have to ask my son. He's out in Portland. I don't know whether he was involved in that.
Portland, or not. Exactly. It was destroyed.
I'll check in. I'll check in with Douglas and see what he has to say about it. I hadn't heard that one yet.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, dear friends, we have to go back to our main discussion today. Yes, of course, we are all interested in what's going on in the United States. And of course, we take advantage of the presence of Jamie here at this seminar. And thank you, really thank you for your information. The main topic of our seminar, which was the inequality and the role of neoliberalism, and I would even say the fate of neoliberalism. We haven't said anything about that right now, except the main speaker, of course, who just outlined the framework of the problem. But now, what's our approach to this side of the story? Tell me, what's the future of neoliberalism?
Well, I'm hoping that it will be challenged. I think the point made by Mikhail was exactly on target. That underlying what's happened in the pandemic was a erosion of our societies, which is entirely the consequence of the neoliberal regimes of the last 40 years. It's very comprehensive, with limited exceptions around the world. Those exceptions are mostly in Asia, and they've led to societies which have much more solidarity and were able much more better to deal with the pandemic than the neoliberal societies have been. So I've actually been publishing on this with a Bulgarian, a colleague of Bulgarian origin, Albina Asmanova. And a piece that just came out today, in fact. Christine Lagarde the other day said no one is to blame. So we put a piece up on Social Europe saying, yes, someone is to blame. It's precisely these functionaries of the neoliberal international order who created the situation. You described it perfectly with a decline in the public health services and the availability of doctors, and particularly the decline in the lower skilled medical personnel is utterly astonishing. A whole group of people who are orderlies and who generally help these establishments to run, the people who get cut out, and we live through the consequences when something like this happens. What I'm concerned about is that in the United States, these protests and the movement, which is very interesting and very important, are not fundamentally challenging the neoliberal structure of the regime, and that is going to mean that, as I say, we don't get out of this until something comes along that does, and I would hope that in other countries where there's let's say, different capacities to conceptualize things, that this critique develops. It's absolutely essential to come up with a functioning system that has to be more cooperative, more social democratic, less profit oriented, more public purpose oriented than the one we've built up.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, colleagues, you are welcome to put questions, make comments, or
neoliberalism is alive and well in Russia. Just the way the recent proposal to give up the flat tax and establish a 15% tax on those who are rich was immediately rejected by Russian bureaucracy, saying, no, well, we will never be able to collect taxes if it's not a flat tax. It's amazing how much this nonsense has established deep roots in Russian bureaucracy and Russian establishment. It's in this sense, we are, as a society, many years behind the American society, whether we talk about flat tax or about LGBT. The public attitude is very negative and sometimes violent, and I can continue with this list. But this is one of the problems which maybe explains why there is so little grassroots pressure in Russia for progressive reforms.
The two suggestions I would make are an estate tax and a land tax, both of which can be administered. The estate tax we've had for a century. It's been much weakened, but it's a very effective institution because once someone dies, and you can freeze their estate, you can appraise it and tax it, and that gives people an enormous incentive to not have so much money when they die. So the whole structure of American nonprofit institutions, universities, hospitals, all that, churches, is owing to the estate tax and to people getting rid of their fortunes before they pass on, and that I highly recommend it as a model because it means you don't have to overthrow the rich. In one generation, you can basically get them to give the stuff away, which is good.
I'm afraid in Russia it will be done the usual way the reforms are conducted in Russia. They will charge not the middle class, but not the well-to-do, but the middle class, and all Russians who have their small dachas and their apartments will be punished by the estate tax, not the super rich.
I mean, it's easy to design one that doesn't do that. If you want to get the rich, you can. Of course, you can say it won't happen. I'm just saying it's a good idea. And if you want something that actually they can't say they can't do it, they can do it. Right? That's the advantage of it. It's a feasible tax. Unlike, let's say, an annual wealth tax, which is something you actually can't do. You can do once.
That we have this new capitalist economy for less than a generation. And only now some of the super rich are beginning to transfer their wealth to their children. But mostly still are alive and kicking.
Yeah. Well, that was true when Teddy Roosevelt gave us the estate tax. That was true in the U.S. as well. We had those fortunes for about a generation. That was when they became problematic. That's basically how we dealt with it. One of the major ways.
Teddy Roosevelt monument also was taken off 2 days ago in New York.
Which one?
Teddy Roosevelt monument in New York was taken off.
Yeah, that's a shame. That's a shame. I draw the line. He was a good trust buster and established national parks.
Nobel laureate, by the way.
Well, that I'm in favor. I'd remove the statues of most of the Nobel laureates. Certainly all of the ones in economics.
Okay, now I understand.
But the Churchill's monument has been saved at the end of the day.
Churchill's been saved. Well, that's a shame. Well,
Okay.
although a conservative friend of mine has been publishing about Churchill's liberal progressive economic views on land and on the welfare state. So,
You refer to the Prime Minister?
No, this is a friend of mine, a conservative voice in the U.S. In the U.S.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was not Boris Johnson.
No, it wasn't Boris.
Okay. Dear colleagues, we've been working, and I think fruitfully, for 2 hours. Should we close now our seminar, or some new ideas, questions, comments emerged? Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, first of all.
Thank you very much indeed.
For our main speaker. He made an excellent presentation, which was a basis for a very interesting discussion today. And as far as I understood, along other topics, we began to discuss the one which is going to be the main topic next time. So Tatiana, I believe, will take on this problem relating to healthcare. Tatiana Chubarova. Svetlana Z, but she's Tatiana. She's Tatiana, yes. In fact, she's Tatiana. It's digital society, you know. Okay, so thank you very much for taking part at our seminar. A lot of you have been joining us during all this 3 months. We appreciate it a lot, and I think that it was, at least as far as I'm concerned, I was quite happy each time to see all of you here. Thank you so much, and let's meet in 1 week time. Bye. Be healthy.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Спасибо огромное.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.
Подожди, тихо.